All right, so Project Herpetoculture. We're going to call this episode 19, aka special episode. Before we talk about our guest and exactly what we're up to, I will just want to say we would like to thank our wonderful and very attractive sponsors. Carly, you know what to do. And then normally I would also give a shout out to Dillon, the GOAT at the Animals at Home Network, but that is also our guest today. So I feel like I don't have to, even though I just said it. Dillon, you're the man. Thanks for taking the time to sit down with us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for becoming part of the network and doing such an amazing job producing incredible episodes. I know that some of your episodes that you guys have produced have been people's favorites, so thank you for that. It's been awesome.
Hell yeah, that's great to hear. No problem.
Yeah.
Of course, we're happy to be a part of the network. We're glad that we can contribute in any way, and we're grateful for the spot. You know, you do killer work yourself, and we also are big fans of the other the other great shows on the network. So it's fun, and I feel like that's kind of so just to give listeners kind of a bit of a background as to why we're doing this particular recording today is you put out an episode a few days ago on a solo show on your podcast, the Animals at Home podcast, and it was kind of a I feel like I might do a relatively poor job of like summarizing what that solo show is about. Would you mind giving kind of like a condensed recap of how you thought about that show in your recording of it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the episode was really, it's almost a philosophy of reptile and amphibian care, or my philosophy of reptile and amphibian care. And I think to summarize it just briefly it was just the question on whether or not keeping reptiles in captivity is ethical. And this is a topic or a theme that I've hit so many times throughout the years of recording the podcast that people who've listened to the show, it's no surprise that I've gone down this path before, but this episode was probably the most thorough example of me going through those ideas. And so I talk about how I got into reptile keeping and then how I started questioning on whether or not this is an ethical practice. And for myself personally, I needed an ethical foundation to stand on in order to move forward with this. So I talk about where my questions came up with keeping, and then how I think you can be an ethical reptile keeper, as well as how I think herpetoculture can benefit society. And I think that's an extra layer that we want to be talking about and adding on to the conversation as well. So we can speak to people who aren't keeping reptiles, because well, most people aren't reptile keepers, so we want to be able to speak with them as well. So the episode itself is really just a kind of condense a 90-minute monologue, essentially, of myself walking through those ideas with everybody.
Yeah, and that's a great condensation of all of that. And it felt personally for me anyway. Just speaking for myself, this felt like incredibly poignant for me, because I feel like we've touched on this multiple times in previous shows with various guests, sort of discussing, because we end the show with the question, why herpetoculture, with everybody except for Philippe de Beaujolais, because that seemed to be the crux of the whole episode. But I feel like I too have had to tackle and wrestle with the why, like moving forward, like if I'm going to keep doing this for the rest of my life, like I need to have like a reason for why I'm doing it. Otherwise it starts to get, I'm just not sure I could keep up with it if I didn't have like a legitimate solid why, and it can't just be to make money, and it can't just be because I can, we've sort of, all three of us, I think, have ruminated on that don't tread on me mindset. Just doesn't really fit the bill. It doesn't, not just for ourselves, but for the people that we share our society with. It's just doesn't really fit quite enough. It's not just because I can, and it doesn't seem like a fleshed out rationale for why we do this. And I think that for a very long time in my life, I kind of took for granted the why. I just sort of did it because I enjoyed it, and I did not think that much about why I was doing what I was doing. And it wasn't until the last like maybe 5 to 10 years where it became a much more prominent question for me. It's like, well, this can be hard to do from time to time for various reasons, whether it's, and again, I feel like this is going to verge on like industry bashing. And so I just want to be clear that I do have, even though I may say some things that sound really negative, I have some much more optimistic and positive thoughts to share at some other point in the show. But, the more time you spend in the herpetoculture community, the more often you're going to see animals that aren't well cared for, animals that rotate through collections, animals that suffer some form of abuse. And oftentimes it might be unknowing abuse, along with known abuse. It's like people know they shouldn't be keeping an animal a specific way and they continue to do it. Or it could be as simple as, oh, I didn't do enough research before I got my chameleon and now it has MBD and it's suffering horribly. And well, what do I do now? And that person doesn't want that burden anymore. They don't really want to do the work to get their animal back up to health. I mean, you name it, you see so many different instances of suffering. And it makes it very challenging to move forward and feel like you can justify continuing to do what we do, especially if you're a breeder. Didn't necessarily have, I don't feel like I have a specific end point to this particular statement, just stuff that's kind of coming out.
I feel like I could chime in there a little bit too. Is there something that you pinged is just kind of like what you were saying about, you didn't necessarily consider the why for a long time. You're just kind of going about doing what you're doing. And I think that that's kind of the way it goes for most of us, I think, in this world. We find ourselves doing things, and sometimes we don't actually necessarily consider why we're doing them. And I feel similarly about herpetoculture that, like I didn't like go into it initially with, like as Dillon describes, like a big picture philosophy or view of what I was doing. But after a certain point in time, I began to realize like, I developed a little bit more introspective capacity and realized like, I'm pretty obsessed with this thing and I spend a lot of my time doing it. And I'm like, really, I can't seem to get enough of it. And it seems like it's meeting a lot of longings in me that I maybe can't even fully articulate. And so then it becomes a bigger question, right? About like why we're doing what we're doing. And I think that like it's an interesting thing to think about, approaching something from the outset with that kind of thoughtfulness. I don't even know if that's something that we can necessarily like expect or anticipate of the community, but I think that it's really refreshing to like see people like yourself, Dillon, and like what you've done with this whole network, kind of offering these insights, to people coming in. And I think that that's like the role that, we as like, more experienced people or more involved people in herpetoculture can play, for those who are coming in, is like, well, actually there's some depth to this craft. And yeah, anyway, it's just some thoughts that came through there.
Yeah, I mean, I like you said, I don't think it's reasonable to say that someone should start with that sort of big picture mindset when they first get into keeping, and that's just the nature of it. But to have that message readily available for people to accept it, and that's the thing, is many people listened to that episode that I made, and a lot of people said, well, this is same type of stuff that I've been thinking about. I've contemplated this same sort of stuff, and I remember when I was a kid, when I only had my crested gecko, and in my childhood bedroom, I don't even think I shared this in the episode, but this is when I started toying with this idea. Is I was looking at my crested gecko in his 18 by 24, and I'm laying on my bed, and I'm thinking, what would that be equivalent for me? If, how much space would I have if I gave him that? So I'm kind of like picturing my bedroom, like, okay, it's probably like 2 of my bedrooms stacked up on top of each other, or maybe 3, so, at the most. And then you start thinking, wow, I'm not so sure I would be happy with that, or, that. So that's where it's kind of started to think about some of the guilt that you feel keeping animals in captivity. And And one of the, getting back to what Phil had said about the rights to keep, one of the comments had mentioned, in America we have the right to pursue happiness, for the pursuit of happiness. And so I thought, yeah, that's an interesting idea. And yes, that's true. And so, but they were linking it to like, that's why we have this right to keep reptiles. That is my pursuit of happiness, which means it's not infringing on what you're doing. And I can keep this lizard at home and it's making me happy. And I think there is an element of that. But also when we're talking about another being, I think I don't think we can stop there. And that's sort of the crux of that entire episode is, I think, because it's a living, breathing creature, yeah, it's great that it makes you feel happy and it's exciting and it's fun. And even if you're doing a great job caring for them, there is still a being that's in captivity due to your actions. And I think there's other steps that need to be made in order to justify it. And I think some people don't think about that at all. And some people just don't care about that. But hopefully I think the message can slowly kind of permeate across herpetoculture in general.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. I mean, it's one of those things that, when I've discussed this with other people in the past, when they'll say something like, well, why do you have to keep like a lizard? Why do you have a dog? Why do you have a cat? Why do you have a kid? I mean, they're not the same thing. Like humans and animals, obviously, they're not identical. I'm not trying to say they're the same thing, but like, plenty of people go into childcare and having a kid and procreation with no qualifications, no real sense of why they're doing it or how they're going to do it or how to raise like a healthy, well-actualized human being. Plenty of people go into these, and we all take that for granted. We just, no one would ever suggest, well, hopefully nobody would ever suggest that, this kind of person should never have a child or something like that. Right. I feel like it's, no one questions, when you see someone walking their dog down the street, I think it's pretty rare that you question why they have a dog. You're just like, oh yeah, like nice, cool pet, and I think that a lot of people will kind of, we'll kind of say, oh, well, that's different. That's different. It's like, well, is it really different? I mean, it's a little bit different in the sense that other domestic animals have either been with us for much, 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 much longer, right? Thousands of years in the case of dogs and cattle and cats and chickens. We've been evolving alongside them or corn or soy for a very, very long time, in such a way that we're almost inextricable now. It's either that or the other domesticated kinds of animals give us some kind of utility, right? So they're either it's like a horse where it's for transportation or work. It's a cow or a chicken or a turkey where it's food. It's corn where it's the basis of all of our food, or wheat or grain, whatever it may be. And so these are all, it's most other stuff that is domesticated goes through those, is in one of those categories. And I feel like lately I have been kind of making the claim or theorizing that that's what a lot of these more newly incoming animals into captivity, that's what they're doing, right? Like this is the beginning process of some kind of domestication process, right? In some ways, it may be that some of these animals are attaching themselves to us in a way. It's obviously not conscious, because it wasn't conscious for corn, chickens, wheat, soy, cows. It wasn't a conscious choice for them. But the idea is that those organisms are succeeding in a way that they wouldn't if they were in their sort of wild counterpart situation. And so I often wonder if that's kind of what's going on with herptiles, with different birds, with smaller animals like, ferrets. And I mean, I guess ferrets are technically fully domesticated at this point or something like that. I don't know. I'm sure there's lots of people. Yeah, there's got to be some. I know there's like real hard definitions of domestication, and there's argumentation around what qualifies as domestic and stuff like that. And I get it. I'm here for that. But it's something that and again, this isn't. I don't think that this is a full-fledged justification, but I do think that it's a different way of looking at what we're doing, because instead of it being domestication in a way that gives us immediate and direct utility, like food utility or transportation utility, I think that reptiles and amphibians and other, in the process of becoming domesticated animals, are giving us a kind of mimetic or spiritual utility, something that, something that is less quantifiable. And I would be willing to bet that the domestication of other organisms in its infancy probably didn't look as cut and dry. It probably didn't look as obvious. It probably, like the first times we, because you look at like the wild fowl that led to chickens, like they're so drastically different. Like it wouldn't have been a perfect 1-to-1. It's like, you know what? If we take these weird birds and put them in a coop and pull those eggs out, we've got food all the time. It's not that simple, right? Like it takes a lot of refinement and a lot of development and interplay between both organisms to really achieve that end. And so, yeah, I guess this is one way I've been looking at the keeping of reptiles and amphibians that at least that helps me see it through a different framework. We're domesticating them for a reason that serves a very different purpose. It's a mimetic purpose. It's a spiritual purpose, it's an educational purpose. And I feel like the other reason I like that as a concept is because you can still, that umbrella will still cover highly ethical means of keeping, you know what I mean? Like, and it doesn't excuse bad behavior in the sense of, well, this snake can't even fully stretch out and it's in this tub you're keeping it in. That kind of sucks, dude. Like if you ever, like, I wouldn't want to be in a box where I couldn't fully stretch out. I'd lose my goddamn mind, right? You'd go insane and you'd die probably. So yeah, I don't know. Does that like theoretically, does that kind of make sense to you guys? Do you guys vibe with that, or do you sound like bullshit to you? What do you guys think?
Do you want to go ahead, Roy?
Okay, I'll go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. I think that I definitely agree that there's something about, I really like the point that you're making about like kind of reptiles meeting like this like spiritual utility kind of aspect. I think that is true, and I've actually even likened herpetoculture in the past to like a spiritual practice or like a devotional practice in some ways. Like I feel like it has a lot of parallels with that, or it can for some people. It certainly does for me. And I think that like what you're speaking to around, I think that the kind of like the driving thing behind all of this, and like a lot of what Dillon expressed before that, in your kind of response to that, is that the well-being of the animal has to be considered and centralized at some point in this for it to become, like I think justifiable in some sense. And like the way you're describing it, like in some ways the well-being could be that like these species, like as you describe, are kind of attaching themselves to us, and in that way are like their preservation is secured moving forward.
Yeah.
And I think that that's likely, like that may prove to be true for some species, in the long run, right? However long this whole thing lasts, I definitely have my own ponderings and considerations about how long the experiment of like Western civilization as we know it now will continue to persist, and whether or not herpetoculture will make it through that is a question too. But I think that in the more immediate, I think where it comes in for me is that we have a responsibility to the conservation of species as well, because that is again the ever-present threat to basically all of biodiversity on Earth is systems collapse, in terms of ecologies. And I think that that's where we have consistently kind of fallen short as a community in within herpetoculture is, like I think Jordan Russell spoke to it really well, and in our most recently released episode 17 of Project Herpetoculture, but just about the distinction between preservation and conservation. And this is also something that Jeremy Thompson spoke to really well in the Kinixis episode on the AHH channel. So I feel like at some point that has to come into our like factoring in of how we move forward as a community. How can we support herpetofauna beyond just like, I think that of course maybe a primary consideration is the welfare of the individuals and the species that we already have in captivity, right? And holding them in the highest regard, providing the highest standards of care that we can, however you define that. And I think that there's, as we've spoken to before, there's a lot of nuance to that, and there's a lot of different ways that you can provide a high level of welfare and enrichment within captivity. It doesn't have to just look like keeping in a bioactive vivarium or whatever. There's a bunch of different ways it can be done. But I think moving from that, the next kind of stage in development, I feel, is considering how we can benefit wild herpetofauna, and obviously, given that we're not playing a role in or that most of us are not playing an active role in like SSPs and kind of things like that. The most obvious way to do that, I think, is to like leverage some of the financial benefit we receive from herpetoculture toward conservation, and organizations that focus on that.
Sure.
Rather than trying to be all of it at once, like I think that we can leave it to the experts on some ways,
Yeah.
And what a lot of them need is funding. And I feel really inspired by examples like the Kinixis cooperative, toward that end, where they're, like, here's a researcher that like is fully qualified to do the work and just needs the funding, just needs the support to make it happen. And like, we can do that as a community, we can make that happen. And I feel like that is an excellent kind of model for how we can, just kind of deepen our impact, I guess, if that makes sense. I'm curious what you have to say about that, Dillon.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And I think that defining the utility of keeping them in captivity is crucial. And I think the preservation is key. The spiritual aspect is really key as well, which, some people who aren't in our community may kind of balk at. Well, you're just feeling better because you're keeping a lizard. Well, okay, if you're not happy with that, then let's go to these other examples, right? Conservation, preservation. I mean, there's addition to scientific literature, something like snake venom, for example, like how much impact has snake venom had on the medical industry and things along those lines. And there really is a sort of a wide range of ways that keeping reptiles in captivity can be useful on a sort of utilitarian sense for our society. And so that's one really important thing to highlight for everybody. But then it does go back to the individual animal as well. And actually, just before I go to that, speaking with the conservation, I'm not sure how much damage our hobby or herpetoculture does on the environment. I mean, I think it's getting a lot better, right? I think overall, I hope that it's small. I know there are examples of horrible things that have happened in the past where we go in and poach a ton of animals, and I know that still does happen. I don't think it holds a candle to like deforestation or, things like, developing, communities were blowing out the rainforest. So, and again, I'm not sort of promoting poaching and saying that we should do that, but go back to your episode you did with Philippe, right? It's supposed to be from few, create many, right? So we go in, make a tiny little impact on that native population, pull it into captivity and allow the animals to flourish in captivity and basically have almost no impact on the wild at all. That should be our goal. And hopefully that is something that continues to happen, and the amount of negative impact we have continues to shrink. But then getting back to the animals that are in captivity already, whether or not they're, 10 generations in captivity, doesn't matter. We do have that issue of welfare. And there is that treating the animals as a commodity that's come up within the last 20 years in a very new way, right? I mean, if you go back 20 or 30, you guys have had some amazing people on the podcast who talk about the old days of herpetoculture, right? How it was about the animal, it was about keeping and sharing information. And then we went down this wrong turn where it became very commercialized and very the animals became a commodity. And I think one of the easiest ways to show that is how animals sometimes are displayed on social media, right? A lot of times we're just seeing the animal alone. We're not seeing the entire package. We're not seeing the environment that they're put in. And that's because the animal is the highlight rather than the entire experience of keeping is sort of sometimes not the highlight, which I think we're trying to reverse. And one of the negative feedbacks I got on the episode that I recorded is there are a lot of people that don't like us having this conversation. They actually want to shy away from the ethics of keeping because the response is, if you talk about this gives animal rights groups ammunition to attack us. Sure. And from my point of view is I think it looks a lot better for us to be talking about this, airing it out, figuring out which direction we can head and how can we make this better rather than putting everything under the rug and hoping that nobody sees it, because everybody sees it. You know, as I said in that episode, you're not going to be able to make it clear to somebody why somebody wants to keep 30 snakes in their basement if they don't already love snakes or love reptiles, right? That's just a peculiar thing to do. And we want to make sure that we're investigating how to do this properly and that we are actually having a positive impact. And I think it's there. I think we're capable of it. It's just highlighting the areas that need to be highlighted. I think redirecting money to conservation is huge. Making sure that the ethical keeping is paramount. There are many ways to do it. I'm sure there are thousands of ideas that I haven't come up with or we haven't even thought of that others can think of as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, some of it even, I remember several years ago, I remember just telling people, telling other friends who were into Uromastyx, just because, each individual sort of niche in herpetoculture has its own woes, and some of them overlap and some of them are very distinct. But one of the things I used to say previously is, when it comes, people would say, well, should I really jump on this guy in the Euro group on Facebook about how he's keeping his animal? And it's like, man, you got to draw a bigger circle. Like if you just go and jump down their throats, not only are you alienating a potential ally, but you're also like making people who keep reptiles look like assholes, and you're taking the opportunity to like set an example, right? Setting an example is probably at the end of the day one of the only things that every single person involved can do. Maybe not everybody can donate to conservation. Maybe not everybody can, take and give their animal like the most extravagant enclosure. Maybe not everybody can figure out the chemistry or the sort of like internal relationship that happens in like in like an active cage, an active terrarium. That's okay. But like, you can always just do the best you can, and I mean, obviously with it, there's gonna be like a certain floor there where you go beneath that floor and things are a trouble. And then you go up and maybe you could even hit a ceiling, right? You could say it's like, all right, well, now we're getting a little excessive, but almost everyone can set an example and just, speak through their actions and the way they keep. And I feel like it's definitely been a big, big, big swing in the sense that I feel like now, as opposed to when I left my reptile, when I was working at a local reptile shop, when I left that store, I don't think anywhere near as many people were talking about the well-being of individual reptiles as they are now. I mean, it seems like such a much more pervasive conversation in the community, which is obviously, probably a very, very, very good thing.
Yeah. It's kind of funny that idea of not seeing them that way and not wanting them to have this higher state of welfare. Like, I'm not sure what the mind, and I'm guessing maybe that's how I felt too when I first got my first gecko, but I can't even separate it now. Like, there's no way I can separate looking at this creature inside the vivarium and then not think about its well-being. But I imagine there are people that don't think about that at all. And there's probably a point in my history where it was just, the gecko was a gecko. I don't even know how to, it would have been a very simple step in my mind, and there wouldn't have been much thought about how he feels, and then people like, oh, this is personification or anthropomorphism or whatever you want to call it, but that's such a crucial step. But I guess there is a lot of people that haven't made that step, but like Phil, you're saying, it's getting a lot better. I think we had a kind of a dip there in like the mid 2000s, it seemed like.
Yeah, I feel like it's an interesting thing. I hear that that refrain repeated often of conversations like this just didn't happen, 10 or 15 years ago. And I think that that is true in the mainstream, but I also think it's true that people have always been talking about this and thinking about it, going back into the origins of herpetoculture. It's like, I mean, I think that Philippe de Vogely is an excellent example of somebody who has been from the outset thinking about herpetoculture pretty deeply, writing about it pretty deeply, and not shying away from these conversations at all, really. And yeah, I mean, I think that even, going back into my own experience of it, I think in some ways, like those questions would creep in for me, but because those conversations were kind of like eschewed in the mainstream, it almost was like a justification for not thinking about things more deeply. And I think that like I kind of would, I think as a younger person would kind of just dismiss it as like, well, this isn't really worthy of deeper consideration, or it doesn't need to be considered on a deeper way. These are less complex forms of life. And I think that there's also some like miseducation there as well, that the complexity of herpetofauna has long been kind of downplayed or diminished, and more like we're obviously understanding that that's just not true. But I think that it's interesting to like you describe receiving pushback, and like we don't want to like daylight these conversations, but at the same time I think that that maybe there was a time in herpetoculture when it was still very counterculture, and very fringe, where we could slip under the radar. I don't think we have that option anymore. We've reached a size,
Critical mass.
as a community. Yeah, we've reached a critical mass as a community that we no longer are slipping under the radar. And especially we're not slipping under the radar in the era of things like Tiger King and animal rights activism, definitely breaking into the mainstream. And so I think it's important that we do have these conversations out in the open, in broad daylight, and express to outsiders that as a community, we are complex. We we have the capacity for nuance. And in some ways that sounds almost like infantilizing or something like that to even talk about it in those terms, but I think that it is that simple on some level, that outsiders' opinions of the reptile community are rarely flattering, and we really have to like present ourselves as as a more dynamic force.
Yeah. And it definitely, there's other things here that, like I was actually just muted a second ago, but I was going to make a joke where you were talking about how, like the mental and emotional capacities of reptiles and amphibians has been downplayed for a long time. And I was going to say that sounds like some really reptile brain thinking, Roy. Because that's just one great example. It's like, this fucking reptile brain level thinker. It's like, well, sorry, man, but I feel like reptiles are pretty damn bright. And it's, and especially the more time goes by, the more and more we find data or information that shows just how much reptiles and amphibians are thinking and feeling. And Dillon, you said something earlier that really stood out to me as well too, which is if you just try to keep that from daylight, if you just try to stuff that under the rug and hope nobody will notice, somebody's going to trip over it and like fall and hit their head on the ground. It's like, it's such, it shows much more maturity and mindfulness and like respectful to just say, like, just have raw transparency. So like like there's like a small scale example of this that has come up for me quite a bit this year. So I've had and I'm going to try to just bear with me. I think I'll make the connection will make a lot of sense. This year I've had quite a few people come to me who have they're either customers, past customers, whatever you want. It doesn't matter. They're involved in uromastics in some way. And each of these individuals who I'm thinking of right now have purchased an animal from somebody, and it's a couple of different sellers. In this instance, I'm not going to name names because that would be sort of inappropriate, right? But each of these people have come to me with an animal that they've bought from somebody who had a problem, right? That they were uninformed about, whether it was a burn on the back of the animal, whether it was like cosmetic issues that went undisclosed, like issues with tails or issues with jaws, things like this, or just straight up scarring or something that was hidden from the selling photo, and then it was noticed upon receipt of the animal. And I have said to each of these people, okay, you need to go back to the person who sold you this animal and that you either get compensation or some kind of return. I mean, it's not acceptable that it's not okay for somebody to do that, and the response from each of these people has been, well, I don't know. I don't really want to out the person. They seem like a real honest guy. And I'm like, what do you mean they seem honest? They lied to you. They're not honest at all. These fucking assholes sold you an animal that is not what you paid for, not what it was advertised to be. It's clearly suffering or has suffered as a result of this person's care, or if it happened before it got into this person's collection, this person not only didn't address it, but sold it to you without informing you. I'm sorry. You cannot let that slide, right? That's something that you should address. Doesn't mean you have to burn down the person's house and ask for all their money. It just means you have to say, hey, dude, you can't do this. This is not acceptable. And the more you put it to the side and stuff it under that rug, the more that's going to reflect poorly upon you, upon what you're doing. I mean, that just sets, we're talking about example setting. That sets an awful example, right? Whereas if you're a person who honestly displays every animal that you transfer, that deals with complaints in a respectful manner and gives people dignity, both the animal that they sold and the person that bought it, give them some dignity and give them some respect and civilized discourse. And then you make right when you've made a mistake and you show, hey, you know what? Hey, that was my bad. I didn't even know that happened. Like it happened to me earlier this year. I sold somebody a Xenogama, and the between when the person bought the animal and when they received it, one of its siblings had bitten the part of its little tail off. And I didn't see it. I didn't notice until the person received the animal and said, hey, when I paid for this, it had full tail. And I was like, hey, you're totally right. It that slipped under my radar. Here's your money back. Like, you want a replacement animal? I'll get you a different animal. Do you want to send that one back? I'll take it back. It's okay. You're right. It was my bad. Like, owning the fact that you made a mistake and not just, it just gives you more integrity as a person. And, you apply that, you just scale that up to herpetoculture broadly. Having some accountability, some sense of responsibility for what we're doing gives you more legitimacy and gives you more favor in the eyes of the public. But if, you just look at like factory farming, right? How completely unethical it is to do what so many factory farms do to their food animals, but people shove it under the rug, and that doesn't help. It doesn't give it it doesn't give it a better name just because you found out. It's like, well, it's actually against the law now to talk about this. Oh, okay. Like, that's cool. That makes me feel real good about where my food's coming from. You know what I'm saying? It's just not, I don't know. It's
well, there is sort of a because of the nature of reptile keeping has been weird from the get-go, right? Even like 50 years ago, right? The people who are keeping, it was a strange kind of hobby. And so there was like this sort of secretive element to reptile keeping that was always kind of there, like a continuous thread through herpetoculture. And then on top of that, that allowed, I think, for more shady business practices to exist, because
Yeah.
it was already, there was a lot of illegal things happening at the very beginning of our hobby, especially in North America, right? Lots of
Yes.
illegal imports and whatnot. So it becomes kind of like almost like a status quo of having this shady business practice as an element to reptile community. And I think you're so right that we need to start, clearing that out and letting people understand that that's actually not acceptable. And for us to move forward, the businesses that are within our hobby need to be operating like proper businesses, not just sketchy under the table type situations.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's, I feel like that's the only excuse me, I feel like you heard that saying, the obstacle is the way. I think it's been attributed to a lot of different people. I feel like it's been attributed to Miyamoto Musashi, who wrote the book of Five Rings. I mean, I feel like the obstacle is the way. Like the way forward for herpetoculture cannot be avoidance. It has to be direct and head-on acknowledgement of the ways in which we can do better, or the ways in which we may have gone wrong previously, and what we can do to try to remedy those situations. Because I like we're speaking right now in just in terms of timeline, kind of right in lieu of when there's all this hubbub about like the big cat ban thing that appears to be hitting the desk of the president at this point, right? Where it's basically going to be against the law to have any big cat as a pet, and have like, weird roadside zoos and like, petting sessions that you can pay to get a picture for. And like, as much as I tend to be I tend to lean towards freedom. Like, I love America, but at the same time, I can't help but be like, yeah, okay, that's all right. That's probably pretty good. Like, it's probably a good thing, Like, I'm not convinced that we should be fucking with big cats in any way, right? In the same way that with something like a tiny lizard, okay, you can do much better. Like, it's the animal's probably not going to suffer nearly as much as a big cat would in captivity. It's just in terms of scale. Like, you could just offer more to something smaller. Like, it has a higher likelihood for a good life than a big cat in captivity, right? And again, I don't mean to be that guy, but I feel that way about retics too. Like, again, this is my opinion as Phil Leeds, not as a representative of Animals at Home or whatever, but like, I don't really feel like retics should be in captivity at all. And I get it. Yeah, there's quite a few people, I'm sure, out there who are going to who would potentially send me a photo that says, here's my retic enclosure. Here's how well it gets a goat every month, or, whatever. Like, awesome. That's cool. You have got to be the outlier. Like, surely there are more bearded dragons living good lives than retics. Surely. Like, and I think you'd be very hard pressed to convince me otherwise of that. I mean, I'm open to it, but I doubt it. I highly doubt it. And some of it is just a matter of practicality. And I feel like there has to be some measure of practicality or pragmatism in what we do. Again, we can't necessarily say the same thing about venomous animals, because, as we mentioned already, venomous animals have a real utility scientifically. And, so there's something else there that maybe doesn't quite fit. But there's something about those giant reptiles, like the huge ones, that, that really just starts to feel, oh boy, it just feels odd. It feels like increasingly difficult to justify their presence in some regard. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's similar to like the kind of thing that you describe around big cats, where it's like large, like there's like a truism around just like large predators in general, that they tend to occupy a lot of space. Like they have huge home ranges often, because you can't have a lot of large predators, right next to each other. The prey base won't support that kind of population density. And so even just that alone, like, obviously a tiger is going to be very different than a reticulated python, just based on their like metabolic needs alone. But regardless, it's like you're looking at something that requires a lot of space. And I think that really definitely applies to things like large varanids. Like, I'm sure they cover a lot of ground. It's like a crocodile monitor isn't just going to spend its whole life in one tree,
Yeah.
And yet we can't, as individuals, provide them even with the equivalent of one tree of space. You know, it's just not possible. So I think it can get really complex with large species like that.
Well, there's an anxiety I feel when I see my animals pacing, and it's happening a lot with one of my bows right now because the enclosure is not set up. So because she just has the floor basically. I've not done anything. People who watch my channel know that I'm slowly changing this room around. I just haven't had time to finish hers. So most of the time I'll just crack open the door and she just roams the basement for a couple of hours, and then that's good. But when I see her moving back and forth, especially if I know I have to leave right away, it just kills me. I don't even like looking over there because that the thought of what she must be experiencing just makes me anxious. And that does not translate across the hobby, because sometimes you'll see YouTubers who have racks of retics and behind them, not mentioning any names, but you'll see the snake going back and forth. And to them, it's almost like, hey, I'm just displaying my snake behind me. You can see what's going on. Where to me, I'm like, you're displaying an incredibly anxious, stressed out snake that's displaying a stereotype that wants to be out. And even yesterday, I saw on Instagram, another pretty big account was feeding off some species of monitor in a Exoterra that's the same size as the one I keep my day gecko in, which is right here, like the 36. And the lizard was it was at least 30 inches long. It looked like this animal could not even turn around it. And I thought, how could you even show that on social media? You know, like, okay, maybe you're in the middle of changing things and that's totally fine. You know, sometimes people run out of money or whatever, you're upgrading, but to actually just put that on your Instagram as if there's no issue optically there is kind of bizarre to me. So I forget how. Oh yeah, we're talking about larger species. Yeah, so that is an ethical side to our hobby as well. You know, the sulcata tortoises, the Burmese pythons, the reticulated pythons. It's pretty tough to justify that. And if we're just going to go down it's on my right to keep a snake no matter what, nobody buys that. You know, nobody buys that. And you barely buy it yourself, right? If you see a 20-foot retic or a 15-foot retic in an 8-foot cage, you don't feel good about that. I maybe they do, but I don't know. But I can't imagine how you could feel good about that.
Yeah.
Oh, Phil, you're muted again.
My bad. Thank you. I was coughing, so I muted it, but I forgot to unmute. But it feels to me because I can, the don't tread on me feels like a religious argument. And again, if you're a religious person, great, good for you. I got no beef. I'm not, but no beef at all. However, I will say that feels like it's rooted in sort of a weird religiosity, which is like, that goes something like, the animals were created for our benefit, so I can do what I want with these animals. Like, I have dominion over these animals. It's like, well, look, the more time goes by, the more we learn that is just not the case. These animals are not mindless, unfeeling automatons that just don't have any experience of the world. There is something that it's like to be a retic in too small of a cage. There's something that it's like to be a damn boa constrictor in too small of in an absolutely dark, senseless box with no stimuli of any kind. There's something that it's like to be that animal, God damn it. And like I just, so this is sort of what we were getting at before we were recording too, which is like, this has just been so present on the forefront of my mind for the, increasingly so over the last few years. It's just something that's more and more present for me. It's because, okay, so I'll even go so far as to say, like, maybe it shouldn't be outright illegal, right? I shouldn't say that nobody should have a retic in captivity, but maybe it should be really fucking hard. Maybe it shouldn't be $150 to $300 at your local pet store. You know what I mean? Like, it should be very difficult. You should have hoops to jump through. In the same way that you can't just have a horse. I can't just live in an apartment and go buy a horse and keep it out in the driveway somewhere, in the parking garage. You know what I mean? Like, you
bring
can't
the baby horse home in the deli cup and
hell yeah. Yeah. I keep horses in racks. Like it's like, imagine if we were keeping horses in those the trailers that people use to transport them from one place to another. That's what it feels like rack keeping is, like in some regard, at least the worst aspects of rack keeping, and so again,
well, I think sorry to interrupt, but that sentence you use, there is something to be like that animal, is such a
Yeah.
crucial mindset to have. And I think that's the main speed bump we hit in our community, is that some people don't buy that. They don't actually think that it isn't like any, they think it isn't like anything. They're just, the animal is, and that's it. But
Right.
there is actually some level of consciousness. There's something going on there. How did you phrase it again?
There's something that it's like to be that animal.
Yes, there's something that it's like to be that ball python in a small tub in a dark environment that has no access to sensory input at all. And the more we learn about how intelligent reptiles actually are, the scarier that premise becomes, and the
Yeah.
more cruel it becomes, to use just to be truthful. You could consider that to be quite cruel if you do have an animal that can have sensory input and actually requires it to have a healthy existence. And it's not like the scientific data is starting to defend rat keeping, senseless rat, like senseless as in dark plain environment. The more data we gather, the more it looks like that's a very, very bad idea.
Yeah.
So it's and I think that side of the community is either not seeing that data, or maybe just assuming that there is data to show the contrary, but it's actually not true. We have nothing to support that at this point, and it's just becoming more and more of an apparent problem. So I don't know. It is. I think that phrase is perfectly said, and it's something that people should use to, judge whether or not they're keeping ethically.
Yeah, I think. Go ahead, Phil.
Sorry, I don't mean. I just want to put this in there that
Yeah.
that's something that it's like to be something is it's a phrase or a way of thinking popularized by a philosopher named Thomas Nagel, who
The bats.
Yeah, it's with regard to consciousness. Yeah, exactly. It's like there's probably something that it's like to be a bat, but there's probably not something that it's like to be a soap dish. You know what I mean? There's probably no experience of being a soap dish. Maybe, I don't know. But it's just sort of, this has to do with consciousness philosophy, but it just feels like apt. It feels like a great place to put it in to use here, which is, with herpetoculture. So, but anyway, I just wanted to get that out there because it's not something I said, but
No, I mean, that's kind of what I wanted to speak about too, is just, I mean, I think that's something that I have long felt is like one of the merits of herpetoculture, and like the benefits to society and the benefits to the individual, is that I think that it helps people to cultivate a kind of empathic reservoir, a capacity for empathy. And I think that that's something we need more of. It's like, just broadly speaking. Go ahead, Phil.
No, sorry. What was it that Philippe said? He said it's herpetoculture is the recognition of another kind of consciousness.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, like, man, talk about spot on.
But I think that, and I think that the implications of that though they're so broad, because I think that in some ways, like, we're living in a time when many parts of our society even struggle to extend that to other
people,
members of our society. We're increasingly divided. I don't want to get too into the weeds on that stuff, but I think that regardless, it goes to show that there's a lot of value to considering another kind of mind, another kind of experience, and trying to like place yourself in that. However, I think that, like Dillon, like what you spoke to about the visceral anxiety you feel, when that one of your animals is experiencing anxiety, or like Phil, you talk about it every other episode, like one of your Euros, goes, you can hear the sound. You can hear the sound of your Euros doing that thing.
Yes.
And I think that's the same thing. So in some ways, it's like, it's not the positive feedback loop that we would desire, because it actually opens us to feeling more complicated feelings, and more complicated emotions about things. And however, on the other side of it, there is a positive feedback loop when you are seeing the benefits, of like having that kind of empathy and then providing accordingly. So I don't know. It's just something that I was just feeling into, is it can be hard, I think, for people to to get on board with things if it requires them to feel something they don't want to feel.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I guess that's true. And so something I wanted to sort of bring up, feels like it was more related a little bit earlier, but it's something that Philippe also said in our podcast with him, and then also I've heard him say this in other instances, where he said something to the effect of herpetoculture may have, you know, may have value to our future society. Like there may be, and I feel like the idea was that there's sort of like could be unseen value that is presented through what we do. And I actually, as I evolved, or not, that sounded really arrogant, but as I changed my mind, going from like, well, there's some level of what I do that's conservation. It's like, oh, actually, that's not true. It's actually more like preservation. Okay, well, there's something that I do that's like important, in like a broader sense. So it's like, well, that might not really be true either. So I've kind of got, we kind of ping through these different arguments, right, and concepts, but I really feel like the invisible arc argument genuinely has some teeth, man. Like the longer I think about it, the more it feels like it actually has real teeth, because especially when you combine it with the possibility that what we do may present some value that is yet unseen, So before we recorded, we were talking about bees and about how my mom she keeps bees. She's got like a number of hives in her backyard, and how I learned through her that, like, we all hear about the decline of bee colonies around the world, and then how the captive propagation of bees, the splitting of hives and the creation of new queens, helps compensate for that loss of hives, or loss of colonies every year, right? And helps keep us all trucking right along. And it's certainly not a fix. It's not like that's not a cure for the problem. We obviously still need to figure out why bees are collapsing, why they're going away and why they're not able to stick and reproduce. Sure, that's true. We definitely do. But I feel like that's a great example of something like, who would have ever thought? Like, people were just keeping bees before because it's like, they do a really good job of pollinating the crops and we get their honey. How cool is that? Like for forever. That's probably all it was for most people. It wasn't like, well, if bees ever go away, we're really going to need something to hedge our bets in case of global food collapse. Like, nobody would have thought about it. And I know that this is hyperbolic and a little bit phantasmagorical, but like, I don't think it takes that much imagination to think, well, is it impossible to envision a time in the future where, like, turns out that iguana or tegu shit is the best fertilizer for coffee, and it captures more carbon, and it's better for the microbiome, so you get more biodiversity on coffee farms and plantations? I mean, that doesn't sound that absurd, but unless we have herpetoculture, that might not be something we ever know or find out. There might be hidden utility is something I think about all the time, right? What are the yet unseen benefits of what we're doing? Even if it's something that doesn't apply right now, it might be something that applies in 50 to 100 or further, I don't know. What do you guys think about that particular angle? It sound like bullshit to you or what?
I mean, I'm going to try putting iguana shit into my car and see if it runs.
Let's go.
Okay, it's clogged.
All right.
I think it's a totally valid point. I mean, and it's not even worth trying to figure out how we might impact. It's just, as long as we are propagating these animals and keeping them ethically and making sure that we're doing our best to continue working our ability to care for them in the direction that they're becoming healthier and more fit and better to be managed in captivity. Who knows what type of things could happen in the future? We already talked about the snake venom, but there could be tons of other things. I mean, reptiles themselves are pollinators as well, right? Lots of small lizard species are pretty active in the pollinating world as well. And that just to compare them to bees, but they're pest management, there's tons of things that reptiles do. We know, I don't think it's not a stretch to say that a species within an ecosystem plays an important role. And that's what reptiles are. So whether or not in the future one of those important roles becomes crucial to our existence, I don't think that's too far of a stretch to make.
It might be just a matter of not knowing, right? It may just be one of those things where it's just, we simply well, maybe we can't point to this exact example because we just don't know that yet. Like when who's out there doing research on how iguana fecal matter contributes to tree growth? You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, obviously it's a nonsensical topic, but you know what I'm saying? Like there's a lot there. I mean, the other thing is, and again, Roy, I'll let you respond too. I just want, there's a book and an author. The author has since been discredited because he cited his own work in a plagiaristic way that was a little bit weird. This guy named Jonah Lehrer, but he wrote, I think the phenomenons that he wrote about were still fairly rigorous, if I'm not mistaken. But you know, I come from the art world, and there's a lot of talk about how, oh, well, art's not really necessary anymore, and it's just this, who cares? We got AI that'll generate that portrait of you for your wall, you know, what have you. The reality is, first of all, that art is everywhere. It's in everything you do. There's an interface design. There's a, you know, like whether it's the Netflix special you just watched, whether it's the sugar packet that you just cracked open to pour into your coffee, whether it's the coffee cup you use to take a sip out of. I mean, all of these things, there was an artist involved at every stage in this. And people take all of that for granted in a way because they only think about art as like throwing paint at a canvas or, you know, drawing a pretty picture to go into a video game. But it's actually an incredibly broad thing. But the reason I brought up Jonah Lehrer is because he wrote an entire book about the ways that people in creative endeavors had kind of unwound and figured out certain phenomena way in advance of science. So whether it was poets writing about phantom limb syndrome in the Civil War, whether it was impressionistic painters kind of unraveling the quirks of the visual system before we had neuroscience to do it, the fact that broken color, which is, there's no smooth gradation between colors. It's in most cases, it's hard lines between, you know, like when you see things on surfaces and, you know, whatever, and it all happens, all this blending and merging happens in your own mind, you know, not necessarily out there in the real world. You know, I feel like that's a very, there's probably some similarity, some crossover with herpetoculture. Like, it's very likely that there are aspects of animal cognition, reptilian cognition, animal behavior and emotive feelings, animal needs that are probably, you know, very well understood by captive keepers that are not understood by people that study them rigorously in academia. I mean, that has to be true, you know, and you know, we were talking about, you guys mentioned conservation efforts, you know, and we talked about, Dillon, how you reached out to the conservation effort that you donate to through the Animals at Home network, and how at first they didn't want to have anything to do with you, right? And eventually they came around, which is really big of them. I feel like that speaks to the open-mindedness of those individuals, you know, working in that conservation effort. But what I'm trying to get at is, anytime I've heard people talk about the captive industry, it's always been sort of up against conservation efforts. Like they fight each other. They're not working together. But, you know, whether it's zoos, whether it's conservation efforts, whether it's academia, or whether it's the private sector, I feel like the sooner people start to draw a bigger circle to include all of that in the same group of people, they're not separate people, right? These are, and in some cases, yeah, maybe Joe Exotic shouldn't be involved in tiger conservation efforts, perhaps, you know, like
ligers.
Weird. Yeah. I mean, maybe we get some more ligers out in the world and that'll get things better. But the point is like, surely there are ways that we can work together in a way that makes much more sense and much more productive means for moving forward. I mean, it's got to be the case. It has to be. Damn it.
Yeah, I completely agree. Roy, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. Well, one thing that was just coming to mind with like Phil's example of like the honeybee, and like how, you know, it's the captive propagation of honeybees that is like offsetting, you know, colony collapse and all of that. And I think that's all like very poignant. And at the same time, I also feel like it's important to acknowledge that the success of the honeybee is anthropogenic. Like,
oh yeah,
the reason why they are the presence that they are on this planet is because of us, you know, and because of our introducing them to the new world, for example. And like, I guess that something comes up for me around that of like questioning, like, well, then what is the cost of that? Like, ecologically, I don't actually know the answers. Like, I don't know if honeybees
Neither do I.
outcompete native bees or anything like that, or what. But it just brings up a question that I want to be like, I have questions about like what else is in the story there, and I feel like it does tie back into like how it's like honeybees are so important because they meet our needs, right?
Yeah.
And that's why we need to preserve them and to further their success within our ecologies and our food systems and everything. And I think that there's also merit though to considering like how do we like move forward in a way where we're like we want to benefit herpetofauna or we want to benefit wildlife for wildlife's sake, like not just for our own um benefit to it. I think
Yeah.
that that is like, not to say that that's wrong to like be considering how we can support it for our own benefits necessarily too. I think that but it's like it feels like it's a both and for me, where it feels like incomplete if we're just considering it for our own benefits. And I'm not saying that that's what you're doing either, but it just like came to mind for me as something to be like holding within all of this murk that we're sorting through.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that.
Yeah, there is you have to be careful that you're not justifying everything to justify it,
Yeah.
because
Right.
and that's sort of a danger about this entire conversation is like it's kind of hard to separate that in some ways, because we are so passionate about these animals and because we actually really enjoy the practice of herpetoculture. Like how much of this question and battling this question and becoming up with the answers for it is just our own internal struggle to make sure that we can go to sleep at night and not feel guilty.
Yeah.
Right. So I
Yeah.
think that is really important that we are adding that extra layer of, making sure that we're not just doing the benefit for ourselves, but for the the wild and whatever else we can have a positive impact on, to make sure that we're not just justifying it for our own sake.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Absolutely.
I think that there was something that was one thing that really stood out to me, Dylan, in your episode was in your response to ARC after they had initially kind of declined your offer of support. You said, I can't actually justify the taking of animals from the wilds for captivity. However, now that it's happened, I can see some benefits. And I think that's something that I really came up against that at some point in my journey with herpetoculture of like, I don't know that I can justify for myself like the inception of herpetoculture, like how it all started. I don't actually know that I can, but like I've never lived in a world where it wasn't already here, in some way. And so in some ways, like I think I have spoken to this before on our podcast, like there's a feeling of the cat's out of the bag. Like we live in a world where animals are kept in captivity. And in some ways I think that it's like I'm like in my community, aside from herpetoculture, I'm friends with a lot of people who are activists and stuff like that. And I think that sometimes I can get a feeling of like judgment from folks on some level that I keep reptiles. And I think on some level it's like, well, it's easy to take a moral high ground about whether or not animals should be in captivity at all, but the reality is that they are.
Yeah.
And as someone who's like clearly receives so much benefit from animals in captivity, like, and I think that there's no doubt that there's profound benefits to society that from animals being in captivity. And I think that those benefits also extend to conservation as well. Like I don't think that a lot of people would be invested in conservation in the way they are, at least in the West, without the presence of zoos and other things that allow people to actually make connections with these animals that they would otherwise not even know exist, or would only exist in a book or in some hypothetical scenario in one's mind. So I think that there is a lot of value to saying like, yeah, this is a a complicated thing. It stands on a precarious moral ground in its inception. However, now that it's here, we have a responsibility to approach it with and make it the best that we possibly can. And I think that that's like where I feel like empowered in herpetoculture and as it relates to all of this, because I think that it is easy to get like, yeah, as you said, it's like hung up in that feeling of like guilt around it on some level. And I think that it's actually there's utility to experiencing that, you know, like that guilt. I think that again it relates back to it's important to have empathy. That can be a driver to progress. However, like it's not where we want to stay. You know, I don't think that just staying in that place of guilt around it is
Probably not the most beneficial.
Yeah, it's not the most beneficial, healthy way to be with it. But I think that it's really it feels like there's like a progression or like a trajectory to it, you know, where it's like you arrive into the hobby, you're not thinking about these things more deeply, you start to thinking about them more deeply, you feel guilty, you become motivated to like do better. And then you know, the cool thing about that is, again, like you've spoken to at length, Dillon, that motivation to do better can become its own positive feedback loop, can become a driver for progression.
Yeah, exactly. And I think too, I think we ought to leave the door open for an actual justification for the initial pulling of the wild, right? Like so you know, there is a chance, and sort of what Phil was saying, like maybe in the future we go, thank God we did this, you know,
Totally.
50 years ago or 100 years ago. Like this is, I mean, is it great that somebody walked across the border with 40 turtles stuffed in their pants? I right now I'm thinking maybe, I'm not so sure, but maybe in the future we go, that was as bad as that was ethically at the time, you know, we can actually say that, yeah, it was, now we can justify it in a moral way. And I mean, I'm never going to talk about poaching and pulling things from the wild and the horrible care that happens when animals do get imported illegally because they're dehydrated and die starvation and all this whole, you know, bad stuff. But you know, maybe in some ways we can say, yeah, it's good that we have these animals in captivity.
Totally.
I mean, I think another aspect of, and maybe this part will be a little bit less cut and dry, but I think it's really easy for people to point at herpetoculture and use it as like a really convenient scapegoat for other problems. And this is probably the most easily outlined when we look at like the disparity between the way people look at reptiles as pets and the way people look at cats, domestic cats as pets. Like if anybody who has a domestic cat and lets that cat outdoors unsupervised is causing a problem. Sorry, just the way it is. Cats kill native wildlife on astronomical scales, and there's nobody out there attempting to revoke your rights to keep pet cats, right?
Yeah.
Now,
or at least no one who's gaining a lot of traction.
At least nobody gaining a lot of traction. Yeah, that's right. Now, there's another aspect to this, which is if we're going to say, okay, what the better way to say it is, name one beneficial industry to society that doesn't have sordid beginnings. There's one. Like, you name it, man. I don't care what it is, whether it's whether it's cars, whether it's like international trade. I mean, you name it. All of these things have horrific beginnings, and it's very easy now to say, well, we don't have lead in the paint anymore, so we're actually doing pretty okay. Is that really okay? Like, it's not that okay, man. The damage was done, right? Like the fact is, there are still people alive today reeling from the health concerns of the fact that industry put lead in their paint and in their gasoline, and everyone was in the dark about it forever, for a very long time. And it's like, what's going to do? What is monetary compensation going to help you? It's not going to change the fact that I'm dying of lead poisoning at the end of the day. It doesn't matter how much money I have. So it's like, you don't, and I'm not suggesting that the reptile industry has quite as horrific beginnings. That I probably would. I don't think I could make that argument at all, and I wouldn't want to. But it's just to say that oftentimes those doing the finger wagging about what you shouldn't be doing are failing. They're doing so from their phone. You know what I mean? I was like, you are contributing to slave labor here, homie. Like,
yeah.
and it doesn't mean you shouldn't have an iPhone. It means you need to just have some self-awareness, have a little bit of perspective. We were talking about this before we hit record. There is no free lunch. There is no karma-free way to live on this planet. You know, like it's just not possible. I mean, I feel like hunter-gatherers who are still around today are probably doing pretty good. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But like, they still got to kill animals to survive. So it's like, it's not the same. The point is, it's just not as clear cut as I think a lot of people like to think it is. It's, you know, yeah.
Well, and there's something weird, and maybe this is, like you're comparing reptiles to cats, and I always compare reptiles to fish.
Yeah.
Not very many people question the ethics of keeping a fish tank. Almost nobody does. They don't really care. And honestly, the entire saltwater fish industry is on the back of wild caught fish, which I recently learned. Like, they're all wild caught. There's very little breeding going on. And I'm not necessarily passing judgment on that one way or the other. But if you were to look at that compared to us, there's a bunch of red flags on their side too, but no one really gives a shit. So it's kind of funny. So I don't know what we did over the past to sort of bring all the negative attention, but it could be as simple as the keeping animals that are too big and too small of enclosures, sort of the Joe Exotic side that maybe tends to be more on the reptile and amphibian keeping. I'm not exactly sure, not even amphibian keeping, mostly reptile keeping. I don't exactly know, but there's this weird stark disparity between how the public sees someone with a giant saltwater fish tank and how somebody might see the enclosures behind Roy, for example.
Yeah, I think that also there's something to be said around that there's just that relates to prejudice or about the animals themselves. Very few people have strong opinions or feelings about tropical fish or saltwater fish.
Yeah, I'm so scared of those.
For the most part, people, they just don't really have a reaction, other than like interest or curiosity or appreciation maybe on some level. But I think that there is so much to explore around how around the stigma that reptiles and reptiles in particular, but maybe amphibians to a lesser degree, carry, and it goes right down to the fact that they're grouped, like herpetofauna, being reptiles and amphibians is a totally arbitrary grouping. Like, they're not actually closely related to each other, which is pretty amazing. And the reason why they're lumped is because Carl Linnaeus, hated them equally. And like, really, and like herpetos, like the root means to creep.
Right.
And that was the group, that was the qualifier that led to those differing families of animals to be lumped together into herpetology, herpetofauna, and now however many years later we still carry that grouping, even though we know that through modern phylogeny and all that stuff that it's actually pretty arbitrary.
Damn, I did not know.
Isn't that a trip?
It's so funny. It's funny when you think about how arbitrary the connection is, but yet it's hard to separate it in your mind.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Like they're just linked.
Yeah. They're just linked. Yeah.
But it would be the same as linking. It's even worse than linking reptiles and birds.
Yeah.
Well,
reptiles and birds are more closely linked. It's like something I get a kick out of telling people, it's like, birds are more closely related to crocodilians and to turtles, and tortoises than turtles and tortoises are related to like lizards and snakes.
Yeah.
They're just like, what? They're like, they cannot, like, it can't be, that can't be real.
Totally. It's very strange. It's definitely, that's like pretty perfect, Roy. I mean, that's a great anecdote to set an example for how like unforeseen long-term impact of choices. Right.
Oh yeah, totally.
Just Linnaeus was like, well, these both kind of suck. I'm going to put them in the same group.
These things creep me out, basically.
Yeah.
I'll just make that change for the next 300 years.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. That's remarkable stuff. That always just baffles me. That is mind blowing. That actually caught me really off guard. I don't even know how to respond to that.
But I mean, I think that again, it just also comes back to like education and miseducation too. You know, I do think that you know, we've had conversations around like the fear of snakes, for example, how much of it is innate and how much of it is socialized, you know, and like I remember talking when our episode with Brian, and Brian is like, no, it is socialized, you know, like very strongly. And I feel that way too on a lot of levels. However, like there is actually a lot of research that has been conducted that like with other primates, you know, like that have never seen a snake before. You put a toy snake in their display or their habitat and they're scared of it, you know, and they have there's no socialized reason for them to feel that. And you know, there's like some amazing studies, like one of my favorite books on it is called The Fruit, the Tree, and the Serpent, about the snake detection theory, which is basically a theory of like how you know, we evolved the vision that we have in relationship to snakes, to being able to identify and detect snakes because they pose such a threat to our early essentially simian ancestors, you know, which didn't have predators like dogs and cats. The apex predators they had to worry about were snakes, you know, way back before the evolution of
well, there's these, what was it
existed.
Dig through my former degree, but there was like, what was a species or I forget, the Plesia dapifor, which was like this like little tree squirrel thing, which I think is what they sort of like linked our past to. So we're like these tree dwelling things that were just getting destroyed by snakes.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that's like still in there somewhere deep down.
Oh, definitely.
You know?
I mean, I think that's so true. I think there's a socialization element to it because you can take a young kid and make them not afraid of snakes. But I think there is a serious innate as well. And like, aren't cats afraid of cucumbers? Like, you ever seen those videos of people putting cucumbers behind their cats? That could be like a snake thing too, right? I don't know. But it's a long, it's like a long thing.
Yeah, nothing makes me happier than seeing those videos, but I tried that with my cats and they didn't flinch. They just looked
Oh, interesting.
All right.
Well, your cats are house panthers, man. They have supreme confidence.
They don't care about snakes or cucumbers.
They walk around flexing their butt muscles at everybody all the time. It's true. But I like to think about that, and I think I mentioned this on the episode with Brian, is that I think it's more of an innate awareness of, an innate respect for, you know?
Yeah, totally.
That can lean towards the fear side, or that can lean towards the admiration side of things, you know. But I don't know. I'm not even sure, you know. Whether simian ancestors, it makes sense, but it's like also we have countless other examples of the way we don't respond to evolutionary stimuli the way we used to either, you know.
Of course.
Like we should be walking around and you know, like walking next to a road or a highway without being like freaked like crazy that a giant vehicle is hurtling by. You know what I mean? But we're just like, whatever, it's cool, man. It's all good. It's just life. But you know, I don't know. I don't have any idea where I was going with that. It was
well, you could imagine that if snakes were a primary predator for our ancestors, I'm sure birds were as well, and there's not that visceral fear of birds too. So I think there's probably a sort of interplay between both. But so who knows where this sort of disgust comes from people? I mean, we talk about those myths all the time: slimy snakes, scary snakes, they bite, they lay in your bed, and then they eat you. So we are sort of dealing with a lot of like poorly constructed myths that I still, even though I talk on the podcast trying to promote reptile keeping more and more, I still do not like conversations with people who don't like keeping, or who don't understand keeping of reptiles. Like, not in general. I'll still talk to those people. I just don't like talking to them about keeping reptiles because the questions I find to be kind of annoying, and even though they're curious, but it's just more like, why would you do that? You know, it doesn't make any sense. It's kind of gross like that. And then you got to go through the whole thing every time. And you know, like, as I said, fish people don't have to go through that, but it's just how our society looks upon us.
Yeah. That's true. I mean, I'm sure as time goes along, you know,
that's what we get for choosing reptiles.
That's right.
That's what we get for reptiles choosing us.
That's That's exactly, yes, that's the right way of thinking about it. Yeah, I think a lot about the ways that herpetoculture may or may not change in the next 50 to 100 years, like how much of it I'll see, how much of it, because by the time I die, like assuming I live to a ripe old age, like just how much is going to change. It's like maybe a lot, maybe not that much, but probably, I mean, I'd imagine if I live into my 90s, herpetoculture is probably going to look really, really different when I'm in my 90s than when it does, than it does at the moment. And that's pretty good. I mean, I take a lot of, I get a lot of comfort out of thinking about that. I get a lot of comfort out of like thinking about the ways that I am planning on changing my engagement in herpetoculture over the next 3 to 5 years, and the ways that that could make positive impacts or negative ones. And, I feel like there have been times when I have decided maybe I'll just opt out altogether and not participate in herpetoculture anymore. Number one, I can't stay away. It's just never really been something I've been capable of doing. But number two, and this is something I also posted about recently, which is like, it's just too similar to martial arts. Like I've watched so many black belts and anybody else just quit training martial arts. And it's like, well, how valuable is that? That's the equivalent of sort of opting out of the reproductive gene pool in some regard. You're like a genetic dead end at that point. And it's been through the dedication of countless long dead practitioners of martial arts that have said, all right, I find value in these philosophies, techniques, concepts, ideas, and I'm going to carry them forward. It's mimetic evolution, right? So it's concepts getting through. And I feel like that is maybe where I place a lot of my cognitive effort now, is like, how do I make this better? How do I, so like I've talked a little bit about this recently, but I'm making a huge change over the next 2 years, year approximately, to my facility here. And it's yet another major upgrade. So I went from one enclosure to now larger enclosures, and now I'm going from larger enclosures to even larger enclosures, and more interesting setups, more dynamic relationships with my animals, probably less breeding overall. I mean, I'm still going to be breeding Uromastyx and other animals, but it's probably going to be it's going to be like a slightly reduced amount of higher quality, like, not that there's any low quality things that I have, but it's, just a changing my orientation towards it, because I feel like it's going to do better for me and for each of the animals that I work with, even if it spells a little bit less money for me. I got to put my money where my mouth is, especially now that we have this show and we talk about it all the time, and we're constantly going over like, man, we really could do better. I'm like, all right, well, I guess it starts with me. I got to do better. So, that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I can relate to that.
Well, so gentlemen, we're creeping up right on 2 hours here. Do we want to?
Yeah, I want to be conscious of Dillon's time in particular, being the busy man that he is.
Yeah, neither of us have children, Roy.
Exactly, I know.
You got lots of lizard kids.
Yeah, lots of lizard kids.
Yeah, that's true. But they are less demanding in some way.
Yes, yeah.
But I think they might poop less, but I'm not sure.
It's gonna be a good battle between the two.
Close. It's neck and neck for a little while.
Yeah.
Well, so then maybe this might be a good time to wrap this one, and then we can say I feel like this is the kind of thing that could be like an ongoing conversation. I feel like I think this is we had our launch episode that was with the three of us, and then we have this episode that's with the three of us, and I think we got a few other like repeat guests lined up for the future, because there's so many people who we speak to where it's like one conversation isn't enough. It doesn't encompass all of what we're trying to talk about or what we're trying to get at. And especially with a subject like this one, where there's constant evolution in this particular realm of thinking, this is probably going to be the kind of thing we got to do just once every quarter or something, and just get together and bullshit about what we can do to make things better. But with that in mind, should we tell everybody where to find all of our stuff? That's probably the next thing to do, huh?
Yeah, and also just want to pitch it to Dillon. Dillon, is there anything you want to like offer in kind of closing? Or I know this has been a less facilitated conversation than our standard thing, obviously.
A little less structured.
And maybe it would have been worth expressing that at the outset, but I feel a little bit remiss for not having done that. But at the same time, I think that this kind of thing has value. And
Yeah.
I feel really grateful, Dylan, for your willingness to just come on and
Yeah.
kind of explore these concepts more with us. And
on short notice.
Yeah. And also would just again express gratitude for you putting that that episode out and just expressing and distilling those thoughts the way you did. Obviously, you know, as you already know, I relate to that stuff a lot, but just curious if you have any kind of thoughts before we move toward closing.
Yeah, well, first, thank you for inviting me. Happy to continue. As Phil said, this is a continuing conversation that goes on forever, I think. So yeah, we definitely need to continue to have this conversation. I'm happy to come back on at some point in the next couple of months too, to continue it on, because it is so crucial. And I think, you know, one thing that I mentioned at the very beginning of that episode that I released was, I'm not talking about how to care for reptiles, but more so I'm talking about how to think about caring for reptiles. And I think there's a massive distinction there. And, you know, we can talk about how husbandry and how to increase your level of husbandry and welfare of the animals all day, because that is also an ever evolving domain with the way science evolves. But it's just this bigger picture mindset that I really want to promote. And I hope that we can bring more people onto this. And you know, Phil, you had mentioned a good thing. It's not about doing all the things, all the good things, all the aspects of how to become a very good herpetoculturalist. It's, can you do one of them? Can you support conservation? Can you increase the well-being of the animal that you have? You know, there are so many different ways that if we're all doing one thing a little bit better, and we're promoting this message of having, you know, not just treating the animals as automatons and, you know, treating them like beings, like it is something to be like them, I think we'll go a long way to promoting this hobby of ours, this herpetoculture, to the non-herpetoculturalists as a benefit to society. So I think I'll just leave it at that.
It's really well said.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, very well said indeed. All right, so since we're all under the Animals at Home network, Dillon is the host of that network and the host of the Animals at Home podcast. Can be found anywhere we find our podcasts. Same thing with ours, which if you're listening to this, you already know that. But then you're also Animals at Home on Instagram, right, Dillon?
Yeah, just search Animals at Home. You'll find me. I think the handle's Animals at Home CA, but just type in Animals at Home, you'll find me there. And of course, animalsathomenetwork.com, you'll find all of our stuff.
Awesome. Hell yeah.
And Patreon links there too, to support what both Dillon and what we're doing. Any support there is appreciated and goes a long way.
It's true.
And,
absolutely.
Yeah, you can find Phil at Arids Only, right? And I'm at Wellspring Herp on Instagram and all that stuff.
Woo! Here, I'm going to stop the recording.